Well, Professor David Schultz, Professor of Political Science at Hamline University. Let's talk about the Russian invasion. It's been, I think, the fourth month now. And obviously, there's a lot of miscalculation and from Putin part. American dragging European in it. And Russians, as this guy is saying in New York Times, is not going anywhere. It's going to be the European and Western problem no matter what happened. And so take us through, it's been almost 100 years since the invasion.
100 days.
100 days.
It seems like 100 years.
Yeah.
Okay, and, good. So first off, you pointed out that Putin has changed his game plan several times. I just want to put something in perspective. Do you remember a guy named George Bush who was president?
I'm trying to forget him.
Yeah, who said that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, or a father before him who also happened to be named George Bush, who wanted to go into Kuwait, but didn't want to say it was for oil and kept looking for other reasons. The reason why I am mentioning it is that we have gone through periods in American history in recent history, where we've been the aggressor, where we've changed our objectives several times as to sort of maybe mask real reasons or whatever. So for here, Russia's argument is a couple of different arguments. One of them is the argument of saying it feels unsafe, and therefore the expansion of NATO makes them have to do this. At some other point, Putin has also said that, well, Ukrainians and Russians, they're basically the same people. At the same time, he has said, well, Ukrainians don't really exist as people. So he's been all over the map in terms of what his justification is. When he started the war on February 24th, most people thought Ukraine was going to fall in a matter of a few days. Quick going in, taking it over. The West had this idea that Russia had so thoroughly revamped its military, had so thoroughly upgraded, it was going to be a snap. And it didn't happen. Well, again, I want to put some perspective here. I think there was a country like the United States that thought it was going to be a snap in Vietnam. I think there was a country called the Soviet Union that thought it was going to be a snap to go into Afghanistan. There was a country called the United States that thought it would be easy to go into Afghanistan. Sometimes great powers don't always get what they want. And here what we're starting to realize is that Russia may be closer to what Obama described it as, a regional power that happens to have nuclear weapons. And it's really not clear now what Putin's objective is. It doesn't look like he's going to be able to gobble up Ukraine in one fell swoop. He certainly can't hold it, even if he does. It's not even clear he's going to be able to hold the regions that he has. And so I will say his war is a work in progress in terms of where it's going. Now, I want to add one more thing to it. Right now, everybody wants to say the NATO and the United States is not at war with Russia. Well, if we're talking about sending troops in, no. But if we're talking about the fact that we've been arming them, the fact that we're using intelligence, the fact that we're now sending Western arms, I don't know. I think we're all at war with them. And I think what the United States is now doing, they've shifted a perspective, and people in the Defense Department have said this. It's no longer keeping Ukraine free. It's what? Degrading Russia's military capabilities.
When Biden, reaction to the mass shooting in Texas, he was calling for, disarming, gun control and taking that military weapon out of the American people. But in the same token, he's sending the weapons to Ukraine.
Right.
So we have like a double moral standard when dealing with the people outside and people here. Here we want to take the weapon from the Americans, but give it to the Israelis, give it to the Ukraine, give it to El-Sisi in Egypt so he can kill his own people, give it to Mohammed bin Salman.
Back during the Vietnam War, when they pointed out to him that Diem, who was the head of South Vietnam, was a dictator, and he was and not a good person, and he said, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. And the reason why I like that is because that explains in part what's going on here. Is that the United States in this situation here is picking and choosing who its friends and enemies are, and based upon what it perceives to be its strategic interest, it is saying we're going to send weapons to our friends and not to our enemies, even if it turns out that some of our friends maybe aren't the most democratic in the world. So I think real politics transcends, let's say, democratic values. I think also here what's fascinating about Ukraine, if we had had this conversation a year ago, and we were talking to people in the State Department, they would have said, Ukraine is not Europe. It's not part of Europe. Now suddenly, what? Ukraine is Europe. Turkey still is not, of course. Ukraine is Europe. Turkey is not. And I think part of it is about what? Religion. It's about race. It's about ethnicity. And it's also about the fact that there is now this understanding, for good or for bad, that the United States has, that Russia is potentially a threat to our other allies in Europe. One of the miscalculations the United States made back in the 90s, when Soviet Union broke up, all these smart people in our foreign policy establishment said, Soviet Union is gone. Russia is going to evolve into a Western European style democracy. It's going to join the West, and life will live happily ever after. Well, somewhere along the line, we saw yet again a bunch of miscalculations with our foreign policy team. And we forgot the fact that, well, maybe Russia has its own interests. And so now we're starting to realize that Russian interests are different than Ukraine, that are different than maybe Eastern Europe, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to say that a lot of what's happening today could have been avoided with a lot smarter and forethought in terms of our foreign policy. I'm not saying, as Russia claims, that expansion of NATO is leading to it. That's a different argument. I'm saying that we made a whole bunch of assumptions, and we knew who Putin was, and the United States basically ignored it all.
What didn't he, Putin, for the last 7 years or so, wants to join NATO and wants to play with the big boys and goes to economic summits, but the NATO and American, they've been treating him like a, like a boss boy and a third world country kind of a thing, that he's been humiliated. And this is a guy that he came out of the ashes of the falling of the Soviet Union. I mean, he built Russia out of the ashes. And as you say, he has his own ambition. He's for God's sake, we almost start the third World War III when the Soviet Union sent a few missiles to Cuba. Why can't the Russians retaliate to the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO? When don't you think expanding NATO to Ukraine and now Sweden, Finland, this is really an overreach, and that is causing some kind of trouble and picking up a fight with the Russians?
Well, in some ways it is. In some ways it is picking it, because it's pushing what? With the extension of Finland to the to NATO, when that happens, that's going to double the amount of boundary area of NATO countries on Europe and
around Russia.
Around Russia, I should say, pardon me. And on one level, because of sort of like a historic, it goes back to the Cold War, NATO was always opposed to Russia and the Soviet Union. One can see, Russian anxieties. The question becomes here, and I think this is the big issue in foreign policy right now, do countries have legitimate zones of interest of which they get to have control over? Thus, does Russia essentially get a veto over Belarus? Does it get a veto over Ukraine? I think this is partly what the fight is all about right now, is are we going to go back to that old sort of almost pre-Cold War era of great powers having their zones of influence?
And I mean, the world is run now by thugs, and nobody talks about how horrible Russia is in Syria. Nobody talks about how horrible Russia is in Chechnya when they wiped out a whole city of hundreds of thousands of people. Nobody talk about atrocity and killing and on all of that. But once we got to Ukraine, which now, as the media cover it as a European civilized people, white, bleeding, and people, and now the reaction is different. If Western volunteer fighting with the Ukraine, why can't Russia say this is our terrorists, like what we did when people went to fight in Syria? So it is really a hypocrisy, and I don't want to hear Biden one more time talking about shared value. And he wrote had a speech, wrote a big article in New York Times talking about, shared value and making sure Ukraine is not going to fall, and and all that kind of. Who consumed this kind of garbage?
No, I think you're absolutely right here. Again, I go back to a comment I made before. We are at war. I mean, there's no way around it at this point. When we've committed, what, 50, 60 billion dollars already in weaponry and in aid. I think what this past week, President Biden announced he's going to now start sending, Western, U.S. and NATO heavy armaments and missile guidance systems, telling Ukraine, remember, promise to us, you're not going to use these to target things inside Russia. Wink, wink, et cetera, like that. I mean, at some point, we've got that. We've got the volunteers. Again, let's go back. We're sharing the intelligence. We are at war. I mean, let's just call it what it is at this point. It's a war in what? I don't know. Is this Korea all over again? Vietnam all over again? Has Ukraine become the new proxy? And in some sense, Ukraine has become the new proxy for the conflict between the United States and Russia. Maybe, as some people are saying, this is part of the new Cold War at this point, that we're back to a pattern that we've lived with for the last, 80 years.
Is this in the interest of Europe? Aren't the United States dragging Europe in a war that really a war of choice now? I mean, they depend economically on a lot of things coming out of Russia. They don't need war next door. You never know what's going to happen. And the Americans are just standing over there, breaching and sending weapons, but they are out of this. And this is another time where Europeans have different interests than the Americans.
Right. And you also, depending on where you are in Europe, you have very different interests. My friends, for example, in the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, have viewed Russia as an adversary and threat for many, many years. Eastern Europe, the countries like Poland and so forth, which used to be part of the Soviet orbit, they view this issue very differently than, for example, at least initially France or Germany or England does. But what we're seeing now is Europeans for a while were unsure during the Trump administration, is America going to be there to be our ally? Well, what's happened now is that what Biden has reasserted is the traditional hegemonic or traditional leadership role for European security, and whether you agree with it or not, you got to give him credit. He's been able to corral European states into marching in the same line, and basically come to view Russia collectively the same way that the United States does.
So what's next? Excuse me. What's next now?
I think it's going to be a war of attrition for a long time. There's really no incentive at this point for Putin to come to the bargaining table. I don't know what the incentive is for the United States at this point. What it really looks like at this point is that the United States will give Ukraine enough weapons and enough aid to keep dragging the war on, but not to really, quote, win the war, whatever the heck win means. I have no idea. And I think, again, Ukraine's become the pawn where we forced Russia to keep what? Fighting, more casualties, more tanks destroyed, more missiles destroyed. And I think the hope of the United States is what? Just so thoroughly degrade the power of Russia that it no longer becomes a threat. I'm not sure that's going to happen. That may be more wishful thinking, but I don't see this battle ending anytime soon unless some major break occurs somewhere along the line. But neither side looks like they want to reach an agreement, or even they're not even at the negotiating table right now.
If Russia been degraded, and I think Russia either way, they're not going to be the same out of this war. This is, and I don't think Putin is going to survive this eventually. But who's going to be our enemy? We need an enemy. Keep us developing weapons and increase our military budget every year. We need an enemy, a major enemy.
We've got at least two, I think, still at this point. There's always like having aces in the hole. The United States still got two aces in the hole.
Plan B.
That's right. It still has Iran.
Yeah.
It still has Iran, and it has China. China and the economic rivalry and the concern over China is interest in Taiwan, I think, keep the military-industrial complex more than busy.
And happy. And China,
happy.
Gotta keep these guys happy because they don't have sense of humor. But China is going to come out of this, the Ukraine-Russian war much stronger.
Oh yeah, yeah, they are. They're clearly were the senior partner to a Russian China alliance. They're going to come out even more powerful. With no matter what's going to happen, Russia is going to be weaker after this, and there's no question about it. Yeah. But China is now going to benefit from what? The oil exports and natural gas that's not going to Europe is going to feed the Chinese economy, and China comes out of this again not really scathed in terms of its economy or clearly its military infrastructure. So that basically shifts the focus to what? U.S.-Chinese relationships again.
Well, Professor David Schultz, Professor of Political Science at Hamline University, thank you so much on a Friday afternoon, and it's a beautiful day. What's entail in the rest of your day? Well,
I'm going to get out. I'm going to finish my lunch and then get on a bicycle and just go someplace.